You will by now hopefully have played the podcast about the Intentionalist School of Thought. This second podcast will focus on the Structuralist School and their counter-argument to the Intentionalists. You're looking at the mind map that we covered in the previous podcast, and of course what we did there is we focused on the Intentionalist School and the various arguments. So we covered the blue strand and the green strand on that mind map. In the frog folder you will find the notes that go with this mind map. So if I just quickly... Okay, back to the mind map. With this second podcast we're actually going to use the mind map. I'm going to walk and talk you through the mind map rather than through the notes. Let's move in. First of all, the structuralist argument. Remember, it is a counter-argument to the intentionalist school. The intentionalists argue that power was very much with the Kaiser. The structuralists challenge that. The whole new area of debate. They say that history is not shaped by the force of personality. They say that it is shaped by the structures and the tensions in the pyramid beneath the person at the top. There are two schools of thought within the structuralist argument. There is the bottom up and the top down approach. So we'll look at the top down argument first. Now the top down school of the key historian who really led the top down structuralists was this man here, Hans Weyler. He recently died. Very, very influential, not just in terms of German history, but also the school of thought, the structuralist school of thought, has been used by historians of other countries and other societies since. So it has very much influenced the way history has been written since the 1960s. So what was basically his argument? Seriously disagreed, challenged John Roll, who was the leader of the Intentionalists, arguing that policy was actually controlled, in particular, by these groups here, not by the Kaiser. So, in particular, think Prussian nobility, the Prussian landowners, the officer corps, who of course tended to be the same people, and also the diplomats, the Prussians in the branches of the Foreign Office. In other words, the elites who surrounded the Kaiser grabbed hold of policy and influenced it and controlled it for their own effectively selfish ends. Also included in that are the industrial elites, the new elites whose wealth and power has come out of the industrialisation. So they, as we know, rallied together, we call it Sammlungspolitik, to influence policy. Now, what were their aims? So their aims were to prevent and lead very nicely one, political democratisation. Nice way basically of saying giving the masses influence through the Reichstag. Okay, so ensuring that power lay with the Imperial Cabinet rather than the Reichstag. Secondly, to prevent social levelling. Again, that's a nice phrase, use it. Social levelling basically means, if you think of our social pyramid, the differences between the levels of the pyramid are breaking down, because effectively the lower classes are moving upwards, and likewise the middle and upper classes are losing their influences. So the differences between the social classes are becoming more blurred. So they were very much aiming to prevent those two processes. Now, how did they do that? Well, partly in terms of domestic policy. Now, we will look at domestic policy in subsequent lessons, but for example, Caprivi introduced a whole new raft of social reforms. You could think, well, hold it, if he's introducing social reforms, isn't he actually giving to the poor? The underlying intention of that was actually to distract the poor from revolution, give them some concessions, so that they effectively do not think in terms of radical solutions to their problems. But also, and Lee points out, domestic and foreign policy were linked. So foreign policy, in a sense, shared the same aim. What does that mean? Well, basically, the elites pursued a policy of what we call social imperialism. Again, fancy word. What does it mean? It basically means building empire, grabbing colonies abroad. How does that serve the aims of preventing political democratization and social levelling? Well, basically, it distracts the workers from revolution. By grabbing colonies, it basically appeals to natural patriotic instincts, and so the working classes, proud of the achievements of their country, will, rather than oppose the elites, will identify with what they're doing and what they're achieving and the gains that they're giving to Germany. So you can see those points there. Empire building, it distracts the lower classes from social levelling and political democratisation. So ultimately, what the top-down strand of structuralists are saying is that the Kaiser was effectively manipulated by a powerful group of Prussians who surrounded him, so that the Kaiser was the expression of the policy, not actually the cause. The policy itself came from the elites. Now we'll pull back because that is one point of view. Another structuralist group, and over here you can sort of see who they were. Richard Evans and Blackburn and Ely in particular led this particular school. And they challenged the structuralists to some extent. They identify and agree with a lot that Weyler said. They certainly challenged John Roll, but their argument was saying that effectively the Weyler and the top-down were ignoring the influence of ordinary people, and these people actually said, well, hold it, the masses, the ordinary people, so the middle classes and the working classes also exerted an influence on policy. So what exactly does that mean? So I'm just pulling away a little bit here. We'll look at this strand here. So the evidence, first of all, the lower classes, as we know, were concentrated in the cities. As a result, they spoke to each other. They became more aware of their problems. Lee gives the example of 395,000 miners in the Ruhr district. He gives an example, I think, of a city of called Bochum, which doubled its population in a very, very short period of time. So rapid change happening. That, of course, looking up here, did have an influence. It frightened the elites. They introduced social imperialism to distract the lower classes from ambitions for more power and influence. So in a sense, therefore, the lower classes, as represented by the trade unions and the social democrats, were empowered. They were influencing what was happening. So the historians like Evans basically argue that to really understand what was happening, you've got to look at local history. You've got to really look at the individual cities and the social pressures. Evans, as we know, did a very detailed study of the city of Hamburg in his early career, and that's where that established him as one of the leading historians. He was a local historian in his roots. And so therefore the lower classes exerting upward pressure, they're represented by the SPD and the Reichstag, that is influencing policy. And so the SPD, as we know, 110 seats, they became the largest party in 1912. They therefore, representing the working classes, which is the ordinary people, had the ability to block government legislation. So they were influential. Now, moving across to the left, the middle classes, Likewise, the structuralists say we've got to look at them. So this is not the very top level of the pyramid, this is sort of the Beamter and the Mittelstand. And in particular, they emphasise the influence of the Catholic Centre Party. A lot of work, Blackburn did a lot of work and showed that the Catholic Centre Party was changing in its nature, was becoming much, much more middle class, a party of lawyers. As we know, they were a balancing force in the Reichstag. The elites, because they were aware that the SPD could block legislation now, if the SPD were going to get, if the conservative elites were going to get laws passed, they had to approach the Catholic Centre Party in particular and ask for their support, their votes in the Reichstag. So that therefore gave influence to the middle classes in the Reichstag. So it challenges the top-down view of structuralism, which puts a lot more emphasis on the elites. The bottom-up view puts more emphasis on the lower classes and the middle classes. Okay, all of those structuralist views challenge the intentionalist view. Okay, so as I showed you at the beginning, there are notes attached to this, so go through the notes as well. Remind you of that. There's page 1. Okay, there's the first page of it. They work in conjunction with the mind map. I hope that was useful to you. That completes this podcast. Thank you. And so on.